This is Kol Birama, the podcast of Congregation Ramat Raz 929 Tanakh Project. Join us each day as we study a chapter of Tanakh, building towards completing all 929 together. I'm Rabbi Yoni Zolti, and I'm glad you're here. Shemot Chapter 9. As we continue our exploration of the plague narratives, I want to examine a fundamental question that applies to the entire plague cycle. What is the purpose of the plagues? Are they purely punitive measures designed to coerce Pharaoh's compliance, or do they serve some other function as well? To answer this question, I want to conduct a close reading of the first plague, the plague of blood, because it contains a textual puzzle that, once solved, may illuminate the entire structure of divine action throughout the Exodus narrative. When the plague of blood is first introduced, Moshe is commanded to go to Pharaoh early in the morning and tell him, "Hine anochi makeh b'mateh asher biadi al hamayim asher bayaor v'nehepchu l'dam." Behold, I am striking with the staff that is in my hand upon the water that is in the Nile, and it shall be transformed into blood. The declaration appears straightforward. Moshe will wield his staff, strike the Nile specifically, and the river will become blood. As a result, Moshe declares, the fish in the river will die. And yet, soon after, God addresses Moshe again and seems to decree a very different form of the plague of blood. Vayomer Adonai al Moshe, Emor el Aharon, kach matecha unte yadcha, al mimei Mitzrayim, al naharotam, al yorehem, ve'al agmehem, ve'al kol mikvei mimehem v'yudam. The Lord said to Moshe, "Say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the rivers, the canals, the ponds, and over all the gatherings of water, and they shall become blood." Three glaring discrepancies emerge between the command of what Moshe is to tell Pharaoh and the command as to what should actually be done. First, the agent has changed. In the initial command, Moshe is positioned as the actor, while in the second command, Aaron all of a sudden is the primary executor. Second, the implement differs. Initially, it is Moshe's staff, and subsequently, it is Aaron's staff. Third, and most dramatically, the scope of the plague changes. In the first command, the target is the Mayim Asher Bayaor, the water that is in the Nile, meaning a specific singular body of water. While the second, though, encompasses all of the waters of Egypt, a comprehensive category which includes rivers, canals, ponds, and every water gathering. These are not minor variations in emphasis, but fundamental contradictions in agent, instrument, and target. So what is going on? As with other doublings and repetitions in the Torah, there are several approaches to resolving the issue. On the one hand, there is the possibility of harmonization, arguing that the two commands are in fact one and the same. Ibn Ezra suggests this approach. He argues there exists only one staff, which Moshe lends to Aaron. Aaron serves merely as Moshe's representative, and the Yaor itself symbolizes all Egyptian waters. Another option is to suggest that there were in fact two divergent commands, but that the change was necessitated by moral considerations. Rashi, for instance, proposes that the initial command did have Moshe strike, but Moshe cannot strike the Nile that once protected him as an infant, and therefore Aaron's substitution was necessary. While Rashi's suggestion is beautiful in its moral edification and teaching, it struggles to account for why the second command extends beyond the Yaor entirely. Moreover, the whole point of warning Pharaoh in advance is to demonstrate that God is the one doing this. So then telling Pharaoh one thing and then doing another would seem antithetical to that very purpose. Regular listeners of this podcast can probably predict that academic biblical critics resolve the contradictions by fragmenting the text into multiple documentary strata, each preserving distinct plague traditions later woven together. This, in their mind, would explain the dual plague. I'd like to suggest, however, a different interpretation, one advocated by Abarbanel and Cassuto. In their reading, there are in fact two commands which depict two simultaneous yet different plagues. Moshe strikes the Nile while Aaron strikes all other waters. These two plagues manifest themselves in fundamentally different ways. In Moshe's plague, Moshe is the one who changes the water, just the Nile, into blood. There is no mention of magicians. After all, if Moshe has already transformed the Yaor into blood, what remains for the chartumim to replicate? The Nile has already undergone its metamorphosis. Their demonstration would be meaningless, transforming blood into already blood. Instead, We are told that the water turns to blood, all of the fish die, and that Egypt struggles to find drinking water. And Egypt's response is to dig wells around the Nile to drink. There is a sense of tangible suffering of a genuine humanitarian crisis. Aaron, in contrast, brings about a different sort of plague. In his version, any body of water over which he stretches his hand turns into blood. It doesn't necessarily all turn into blood at once, and so the magicians are able to respond and replicate the same experiment. In this version, there is no mention of Egypt suffering in the same manner. Instead, Pharaoh is able to sit comfortably in his palace without any issues. And we read that Pharaoh turned and entered his house, and he did not take this to heart either. This dual structure in the first plague reveals something fundamental about the entire plague cycle. The answer to our opening question, what is the purpose of the plagues, lies in recognizing a theological distinction encoded throughout the plague narratives. The difference between Makot, plagues as afflictive punishments, and Moftim, signs as demonstrative wonders. A maka, at its core, constitutes a humanitarian catastrophe. It inflicts tangible suffering upon Egypt's population, disrupts their economic infrastructure, and creates unbearable living conditions designed to pressure Pharaoh through popular distress. The maka operates in the realm of consequence and coercion. When the Nile becomes blood, when fish die and the water becomes undrinkable, when Egyptians must dig desperately around the river for potable water, this is a maka. It creates genuine hardship, forces recognition of crisis, and generates internal pressure on Pharaoh to relent. The humanitarian dimension of Makot explains their repetitive escalation throughout the plague cycle. Each maka increases in severity and scope, creating progressively more unbearable conditions. The Makot speak the language of suffering, of deprivation, and existential threat. They target the body politique, the economic infrastructure, the material conditions of Egyptian life. Their purpose is fundamentally coercive, to make continued resistance to God's will materially impossible. A mofet, by contrast, constitutes a religious epistemological argument. It operates not primarily through suffering, but through demonstration. The mofet seeks to establish theological truth, to prove divine supremacy, to confound rival religious claims. When the text repeatedly emphasizes, "V'yadeu Mitzrayim ki ani Adonai," that Egypt may know that I am the Lord, it articulates the mofet's essential purpose. The mofet doesn't merely afflict, it reveals. It doesn't merely punish, it proves. A key distinction between a mofet and makot is the role of the chartumim. Commonly translated as magicians, the chartumim were the religious and spiritual guides of Egypt. When engaged with moftim, with a theological contest over whose god possesses superior power, the chartumim are relevant, and so they become part of the narrative. When the chartumim successfully replicate blood in frogs, they're engaging with the mofet dimension, the theological contest. Their successful replication doesn't diminish the coercive power of the Makot themselves. After all, blood and frogs still afflict Egypt, but it does create a religious ambiguity, suggesting that perhaps Egypt's gods can match the Hebrew deity. This ambiguity is precisely what the narrative intends to create and then systematically dismantle. As the plagues progress, the chartumim's capacities diminish. With lice, they fail entirely. We're told that the musicians tried and failed to do so. And they concede, Etzba Elohim hi. This is the finger of God. The mofet has achieved its demonstrative purpose. Egypt's religious specialists acknowledge defeat. By the later plague, the chartumim cannot even stand before Moshe. The theological contest concludes decisively. And yet, at the same time, the Makot continue escalating because coercive pressure remains necessary even after theological victory has been established. This distinction between Makot and Moftim maps onto a parallel distinction between Moshe and Aharon's respective roles and identities throughout the plague narrative. Aharon is the Kohen, the priest, the cultic functionary, the religious specialist. The Kohen operates within the sphere of sacred theater, orchestrating visible demonstrations of divine power through ritual acts. This is precisely the domain of the mofet, the religious sign, the miraculous demonstration, the visible proof of divine presence and power. This explains why the chartumim engage exclusively with Aharon rather than Moshe throughout the plague cycle. As Egypt's own ritual specialists, the chartumim recognize Aharon as their counterpart. a fellow religious professional operating within the shared ancient Near Eastern framework of magico religious praxis. The contest between Aharon and the chartumim constitutes a professional competition, a demonstration of whose ritual technique and divine patronage proves superior. Moshe, by contrast, is not primarily a cultic functionary, but a prophet, a navi, a divine spokesperson whose authority derives from direct divine communication rather than ritual expertise. When Moshe acts, he operates through prophetic commission, executing divine judgments announced beforehand through prophetic warning. He appears before Pharaoh as a divine emissary, delivering God's demand to send forth my people, warning of specific consequences for refusal, and executes the threatened punishment. This prophetic dimension explains why Moshe's plagues follow the warning fulfillment pattern so precisely. Before each maka, Moshe announces, if you refuse, then this specific disaster will occur. The prediction's fulfillment validates his prophetic credentials and demonstrates genuine divine authorization. The maka proves divine power through fulfilled prophecy, the distinctly prophetic mode of establishing truth, while the mofet proves it through miraculous demonstration. Returning then to the plague of blood, we can now appreciate why it operates on two levels, and why this same pattern recurs throughout the plague cycle. Moshe's strike against the Yaor constitutes a maka, a humanitarian affliction that deprives Egypt of potable water and creates a genuine crisis. This is the form of punishment and coercion, designed to pressure Pharaoh through popular suffering. In contrast, Aaron's comprehensive strike against all of Egyptian waters constitutes a mofet, a religious demonstration that invites chartumim's response and establishes the parameters of theological contest. The same bifurcated structure characterizes the plague of frogs, Fardea. Again, we find dual commands with Moshe and Aharon operating in tandem. Again, the chartumim respond specifically to Aaron's demonstration. The theological contest continues while the humanitarian crisis escalates. Throughout the plague cycle, individual afflictions function primarily as either Makot or Moftim, though many contain elements of both. The plague of wild animals, for instance, operates primarily as a maka, a pure, afflictive punishment with no reported chartumim response. In contrast, the plague of darkness possesses a strong mofet characteristic, directly challenging Egyptian sun worship and cosmological confidence. The final plague, the death of the firstborns, combines both dimensions with devastating force, serving simultaneously as ultimate coercive pressure and definitive theological demonstration of divine supremacy over life and death itself. Thus, the textual tensions we observed in the first plague reveal themselves not as scribal confusion, but as sophisticated theological architecture that structures the entire Exodus narrative. The dual nature of the plagues encodes a fundamental truth about how divine power operates in history. Through both demonstration and affliction, through both religious proof and coercive pressure. Aharon and Moshe together represent the fullness of divine engagement with human resistance. Aharon the priest generates the Moftim that confound Egypt's religious establishment, while Moshe the prophet executes Makot that create unbearable conditions and pressures Pharaoh through popular suffering. Neither dimensions alone would suffice, but together they achieve what the narrative aims toward from the beginning, V'yad'u Mitzrayim ki ani Adonai, that Egypt may know the Lord through both miraculous sign and devastating consequence. Thank you for joining today's learning. See you tomorrow for the next chapter of Tanakh.